Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. You know, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on around the world with the weather and with the banking system. I call it the eco disaster, and it's all tied to cheap money. Stacy Herbert, talk to me.
Max, the first headline is, "You're insane if you don't own gold," investors told. So this is a little clip here where Robin Griffiths from Cazenove Capital is interviewed.
Within the bigger picture, which the downtrend in the dollar is awesomely powerful, and one I think one of the most important call, and to give him his due, Bill Gross has made this call. It's vital to get yourself out of the dollar long term on any significant rally. Continuing to earn a currency that is going to be printed virtually into oblivion, that's the official policy, is crazy. So the current rally in the dollar is actually a great selling opportunity.
If it's crazy to own a currency that's going to be constantly printed, I'm guessing then you are bullish on gold.
Absolutely right. I think not owning gold is a form of insanity. It may even show unhealthy masochistic tendencies which might need medical attention. And it's not just gold. Even the base metals, copper and all of those, have made new all-time high breakouts, which is always and everywhere a buying signal. So real assets, hedge, paper money being printed into oblivion. So you've got to own gold, and you've got to own other commodity-related investments still.
Oh yeah, you'd be crazy if you are still in that paper stuff. You know, remember the crash JP Morgan buy silver campaign that went viral, went global? It's got people all over the world buying silver. I've upped the arms race against JP Morgan and the paper money schmadas, as I call them. I got here a new rubber stamp. It says crash JP Morgan buy silver. And I stamp paper money with this crash JP Morgan buy silver stamp. And I circulate this money throughout the economy, all over my euros and my dollars, wherever I go, to get the meme, the message around the world. Get yourself one of these rubber stamps and get the word out. Crash JP Morgan buy silver. What else?
Are you saying that people accept your Obama dollars?
These little Obama dollars. Well, in Europe they do, because they're still fascinated with Obama. They don't realize that he's just a JP Morgan puppet.
So this man is saying that to not own gold is insane. And you know, the mainstream media, including the JP Morgans of the world who support this fiat currency regime, will tell you, in fact, you're the insane one. Now we're going to show you how insane it is to believe in that fiat currency system that relies on these banking criminals that we talk about to maintain stability. 2 dead, 4 injured in Chile gas hike protests. So protests over gas price increases of 17% are intensifying far southern Chile. The protests are the first major political challenge to face Chilean President Sebastián Piñera this year. He made a campaign promise that gas prices wouldn't rise, but the state-owned petroleum company has had trouble maintaining supplies.
Yeah, why are gas prices going up? Is the demand suddenly, shockingly higher? No. The supply of cheap money is quantitative easing 2, quantitative easing 3, quantitative easing 4. That's what's driving the price higher. It all goes back to cheap money in these central banks. They're the root of the problem.
Recall, we just interviewed Gonzalo Lira, who mentioned that the Chilean central bank only a few weeks ago started printing money to buy dollars in order to suppress the price of the value of their currency. So it's part of the currency wars as well.
That's right. Currency wars are upon us. And with every war, there is, of course, propaganda. So you'll find people writing stories, as you were mentioning here. That's propaganda. This is the Tokyo Rose of the currency wars, trying to put out the bad word.
Well, here's propaganda, as you're talking about. Meet the central bank chief whose reckless money printing is causing commodity spikes and riots worldwide. This is from Business Insider. Chief Paperbug, Joe Wiesenthal there, as we always tease him, he is saying that the People's Bank of China and their central bank head is the cause for these riots because they're the ones causing inflation, and he shows the M2 money supply chart in order to back up his claim.
Joe Wiesenthal is a propagandist. Obviously, the U.S. dollar and the Federal Reserve Bank, with the world's reserve currency, is the source of all of this cheap money, not China. China's just trying to respond to what's going on in the Fed. Shame on you, Joe Wiesenthal. The silver bugs will crush you.
Well, there are some people not being insane, and we've been talking about these riots and food riots and commodity riots happening around the world. And in one of the locations is India, of course, where we've seen some protest over food prices and inflation and commodity prices. Now, here's a headline where you might be able to read between the lines. India, Iran mull over gold for oil for now. So India is determined to ensure steady crude oil supplies from Iran and is even considering settling payments with gold in the short term before the countries agree on a mutually accepted currency and a bank to clear the transactions.
There's a mad scramble for gold by these countries, by these central banks, because they realize that a global gold-backed currency is coming. Remember Medvedev holding up the gold coin at one of the recent international confabs. He knows what's going on. We know what's going on. And India knows what's going on.
Yeah, and you could perhaps look at this as diplomatic way out of saying we're ditching the dollar. India is, an ally of the U.S. And how do they ditch the dollar without causing turmoil in the markets or upsetting one of their benefactors?
Well, let me make this following prediction. China is buying European bonds. Why are they doing this? I think it's because at some point they will demand payment in the form of gold. In the European zone, there are about 11,000 tons of gold, which would be the highest concentration of gold in the world, higher than even the U.S.'s 8,000 tons of gold. China, moving into Europe, buying those bonds, of course, Europeans will never be able to pay off those bonds because their economies are in free fall, and then China will turn around and say, okay, you can't pay us back in euros, but we'll take the payment in gold.
And just to put this into context, India imports 80% of the 184 million tons of crude oil it refines every year. So this is another thing in this commodity insanity tied to the central banking, money printing insanity, is a lot of these countries have to import many of the commodities that they use and consume, number one being energy. And how are these people going to compete while also racing to the bottom with their own currency?
That's correct. It's a cluster beep of currency manipulation and post-1970s petro-dollarification.
Now, at the top of the show, we also mentioned the crazy people, the insane.
Who you call crazy? I'm not crazy. You saying I'm crazy? Not me. I'm sane.
JP Morgan's CEO Dimon says more U.S. municipalities may file for bankruptcy. So this is JP Morgan Chase Chief Executive Jamie Dimon, and he says he expects more U.S. municipalities to declare bankruptcy and urged caution when investing in the $2.9 trillion public debt market in the United States.
Jamie Dimon, he's a suicide banker and a financial terrorist because if memory serves, going back a ways, what's the other part of this? I think there's another part of this whole thing.
Many of the municipalities right now are going bankrupt because of declining revenue, but they were started down that path of bankruptcy, you might recall, by headlines we were covering last year. This is from 2009. JP Morgan settlement. Bank to pay SEC over $700 million over charges of illegal payments. So JP Morgan Chase last year agreed to pay $75 million in fines and forfeit $647 million in fees to settle federal regulators' charges that it made unlawful payments to friends of public officials to win municipal bond business in Jefferson County, Alabama. And just in December of last year, some JP Morgan municipal bond traders actually pled guilty to criminal charges.
Right. So, a couple of years ago, JP Morgan, vulture capitalists, fly into these municipalities. They load up the municipality with toxic debt. They engage in debt swaps, convincing the local rubes that somehow they're going to lower their interest costs. And of course, they are lower for the first couple of weeks. And then, boom, they're skyrocketing, bankrupting the county. Flash forward 2 years. Jamie Dimon predicts trouble for the municipalities who can't pay their debt that he engineered. He put the debt into their pockets! Okay, now, if that's not the very definition of financial terrorism, throw away your dictionary and buy a new one. Dimon is a suicide banker. He's a threat to society, worse than Sarah Palin.
And it's kind of the equivalent of, recall, a year ago, 2 years ago, when Goldman Sachs was advising clients to get out of Greece, knowing that they had sold them the credit default swaps to hide all their bad debts. Now, JP Morgan is the number one player in the whole municipal bond market. So they would know how much dodgy collateralized debt swaps and all sorts of crazy stuff is in there.
Yeah, and the defense both Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan use is they say, we're making a market, which is a whack-a-mole defense, because you can say anything is making a market. It's completely vague to say we're making a market, or supplying liquidity. That's another thing you'll hear Lloyd Blankfein or Jamie Dimon say. Both of those reasons are made up concoctions that they pull out of their nether regions that mean nothing, and anyone prosecuting these guys should hold them account for basically making up gobbledygook and lying and committing acts of financial terrorism.
And we've also mentioned the shooting rampage in Arizona a week or two ago. Here's a headline in response to that. This is a very American story. Firearm finance. American gun industry thrives in any economy, and Glock sales surge after shooting. So instead of hurting sales, the massacre had the $499 semi-automatic pistols popular with police, sports shooters, and gangsters flying out the doors of a Glockmeister stores in Mesa and Phoenix.
Oh, remember when Goldman Sachs was busted for market manipulation? A lot of the bankers were packing Glocks on their way to work. So there's another big area of sales. But here's an interesting way to look at this whole thing. I mean, I got an idea. If you wanted to take over a gun manufacturer using a leverage buyout, what you do is you go to the bank like a Sachs or JP Morgan and you say, I'm going to ensure that a year from today there will be 10 of these political assassination attempts in America, and I'm going to use that as collateral to borrow the money to buy the gun manufacturer, then strip it of all of the employees and pension benefits, keep the difference in cash. All I have to do is make sure that a year from now there are 10 more political-like assassination attempts, which should be easy in a country like America that thrives on political assassination attempts. If there was no political assassination attempts, there would be no Fox News, there would be no Roger Ailes, there would be no Bill O'Reilly, there would be nothing on TV except for Romper Room, and frickin' Captain Kangaroo would be brought back because that's the only last thing they had of any importance on that frickin' channel.
But there was an interesting little tidbit in one of these articles about this booming sales in Glocks, and that is that nothing fuels gun sales like uncertainty about the future, particularly when such uncertainty centers on the availability of handguns. The last pronounced surge in sales came in the wake of 2008's financial crisis.
You never go broke in America selling guns. But remember that you need bullets, and the sales of bullets are going to be tightly controlled. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. When we come back, much more. Stay right there. Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. The time now to go to Germany and speak with economist Cher Hever of the Alternative Information Center. He's the author of The Economy of the Occupation Bulletin. Welcome, Cher.
Hi, Max, and thanks for having me back in your show.
All right, fantastic. Now, Cher, I want to talk about the war economy and how the WikiLeaks cables reveal what's going on in Israel. So what does a war economy look like? Who are the power players? Where does the capital flow?
Well, in fact, the WikiLeaks discoveries are not that important in that respect, because a lot of people already knew that Israel is a war economy. The information is pretty much out there already. A recent study that was published 2 years ago found that approximately 12.3% of Israel's GDP is invested into war, security, the military. And there are two ways to look at that. You can either say, okay, 12.3% is means that almost 90% of the Israeli economy is not into war, which is true. But another way to look at it is actually that Israel has the highest proportion of GDP invested in security, military, compared to any other country in the world. Just to put into proportion, most European countries have between 1% and 2% of their GDP go into their defense budgets, and the United States, which is a very militarized economy, has 4.5%, so about a third of Israel.
Well, how do they hide the cost for the nuclear bomb program? Because apparently Israel's got about 200 nuclear warheads, and of course that's against international law, but they need to pay for it somehow. How do they hide that in the books?
Well, the entire budget of defense is actually a state secret. Nobody can know what's inside there. and it's just a big number.
Okay, so that 12% number is understated by at least the factor of the nuclear arms program, which is a pretty expensive program. So I figure you got to double the 12.5% right there.
I'm not sure if it's not already included there, because already we're talking about many, many billions for a very small country, after all. It comes at the expense of a lot of social services that have been significantly cut and eroded over the years. So that means there's now a crisis in almost every aspect of Israel's economy. And there's very high level of poverty, but the money that goes to the military programs is not being cut. I don't think actually that the nuclear program is the biggest expenditure. It's probably quite big, of course, but there are other forms of expenditure that are perhaps even bigger. For example, the cost of jails. And currently there are approximately 11,000 political prisoners in Israel's jails, and constantly there are more and more people being imprisoned, and all of this a huge expenditure on more and more jails and more jail space, even though the prisoners, of course, are kept in very crowded conditions, and protecting and guarding all these prisoners. Some of them are 12-year-old, 10-year-old prisoners. This is something that is a very heavy burden on the Israeli economy.
All right, well, let's talk about these WikiLeaks cables some more. According to the WikiLeaks cable, Israel plans total war on Lebanon, Gaza. The U.S. cables quote Israel Chief of Staff General Gabi Ashkenazi telling a U.S. congressman, "I'm preparing the Israeli army for a major war, since it is easier to scale down to a smaller operation than to do the opposite." Your thoughts?
Well, even before the invasion of Lebanon in 2006, Israeli officers said they are going to adopt the Dahia doctrine. The Dahia doctrine means that Israel will stop at nothing and basically bomb without any restraints, even considering the fact that there are civilians living in the areas where they plan to bomb. And this has been public knowledge since 2006. In that sense, the WikiLeaks didn't really add a lot of new things. What's perhaps more interesting is the fact that officials, both in Europe and the United States and other countries, are well aware of the Dahia program by Israel, and yet they do nothing about it. They don't mention it. They keep on reiterating that Israel has a right to defend itself, regardless of the disproportionality use of force and the massive massacre of innocent civilians. But I think the way to look at it, at this idea of all-out war and complete lack of restraint, is not that Israeli officers such as Ashkenazi believe that Israel has something to gain by using more force. It's not that they really have a strategy whereby if they bomb another refugee camp and kill another 1,000 people, somehow that will make Israel more secure. I think the way to look at it is from a different angle. In fact, the problem is that a lot of Israeli soldiers, even low-ranking soldiers, are completely out of control. And the problem is that the Israeli government has really no way and no desire to try to rein in these soldiers and to try to make any of these soldiers bear responsibility for their crimes. Of course, by doing that, they're also accepting responsibility upon themselves, and they are becoming war criminals. But while these soldiers are violating international law, the Israeli government sees it as its responsibility to protect them rather than to protect the victims. And in fact, very recently, the Israeli Knesset is moving forward the plan to draw a list of Israeli organizations. One of them is the organization where I work for, who are suspected of gathering information on the Israeli military. So activities such as I'm doing right now, giving you an interview, is considered disloyal activity, which is now monitored by the Israeli government, and the organizations which participate in these activities are being hunted by the government, and the workers in these organizations are currently at risk of being interrogated and even arrested.
All right, so what's the upside here for Israel? They want more land for condos? I mean, there's a global real estate crash. What are they pushing for exactly? What's their objective? Because there doesn't seem to be much economics behind the push toward more condominiums. I mean, they could always go to Florida and build plenty of condominiums there. So what exactly is the upside? Or this just a matter of a bunch of sadists with weapons murdering people for no ideology other than the ideology of sadism?
Well, it's neither of these things. If you try to find one comprehensive strategy of the Israeli government which tries to achieve a clear goal, you will find none. Because in fact, the Israeli government is paralyzed from within by different factions, each one with their own strategy, with their own ideology. You have the settlers who are led by a group of messianic, ultra-religious fanatics who believe that God has promised them the land, and giving up any centimeter of land would be sacrilege.
Wait a minute. God promised them the land. Well, Britain and America promised them the land in 1948. What's this God promised them the land theory? I mean, I believe in the flying spaghetti monster, and I could say that Kansas is owed to me. It doesn't make it true, does it? I mean, by the largesse of the U.S. and the U.K., they carved out a thing called Israel. Now, that's about it. Now, what's this whole mandate, religious mandate we're talking about? That nobody put that in the cards to begin with. How do they get away with that?
Well, that's a very good question, because in fact most of the Israeli officials in government, they're quite aware that this group of religious fanatics are not promoting Israel's, let's say, official interests. However, it seems much easier for people like Netanyahu and other leaders in Israel to shift the blame over to these religious fanatics and say, well, the reason that Israel cannot withdraw from a certain Palestinian area, from a certain Palestinian town, is that these religious people are just too powerful, and their grip over the Israeli politics is just too strong, and they're being used as a kind of scapegoat. And it doesn't mean that some of these people are not very violent, and there's a lot of violence every day perpetuated by religious extremists. But in fact, all of that violence together cannot compete with the official violence that is employed by the Israeli army. What the Israeli government has been able to achieve in its dealing with the United States and also with Europe is to shift the blame. So that when Obama has to explain, for example, when Barack Obama has to explain why he was not able to convince Israel to dismantle any settlements in the West Bank, his answer would be, well, the Israeli government is very fragile, the coalition might collapse if those religious fanatics on the right don't get appeased, they don't get their share. And this serves as a kind of block all or stop all magical cure to prevent any kind of compromise, any kind of advancement towards peace and any kind of demand for justice from Israel.
It sounds like a situation where you've got a 2-year-old holding a knife and everyone's afraid to approach it because they don't know what's going to happen. Let me ask you this. You mentioned earlier that something like 12.5% of Israel's GDP is tied to militarization. You also mentioned that another big portion of the GDP is tied to prisons. What percentage of the GDP is tied to operating the biggest open-air prison in the world, Palestine? How much money does Israel make per year by operating that gulag prison called Palestine?
Well, Israel doesn't make so much money, it loses money. And that's a very interesting thing, because if you look at the early days of the occupation of the Palestinian territories, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Israel set up many mechanisms by which to profit from these areas, by exploiting cheap Palestinian labor, by exploiting the land, exploiting the water resources, and using the Palestinian cheap captive market for marketing Israeli goods. But the more the Palestinian resistance has been organized and been effective in putting the Israeli army on edge, the more Israel has been losing money to keep control over the Palestinian territories. And you mentioned the biggest open-air prison. I would say the Gaza Strip is the world's current biggest open-air prison in the world, with 1.5 million people living there. And there were quite interesting revelations in WikiLeaks regarding how Israel treats the Gaza Strip and why Israel operates the siege over the Gaza Strip. And what I find extremely interesting but also extremely worrying is the fact that the economic interest, the economic agenda whereby Israel would always be willing to make some money, let's say by allowing the international community to send money to Gaza, to sustain the refugee camps, but actually do so by buying products from Israel, products made in Israel, and thereby create a nice little export venue for Israeli companies. Now, Israel is even blocking that. So the siege is now has such a strong momentum, such a strong element of hatred to it, that it even costs money to the Israeli government.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a lost leader, like a grocery store put milk in the front or in the back of the store, and they'll sell it at a loss to get people to buy other stuff at the grocery store. I mean, they make money at it. If Israel didn't make money operating a ghetto in the Gaza Strip, they would shut it down in a heartbeat. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Stacy Herbert of the Alternative Information Center. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.